No.
Okay.
Not cool.
The Manitoba Craft Council acknowledges that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Ojibwe Cree nations. We live on the ancestral traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe people. We welcome Nichol and Sarah, two artists from Lens Reflex, and Leif Norman, one of the jurors and the director of the Flash Photographic Festival. Lens Reflex will be open to the public until August 29th. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and please enter your questions onto the right side of the screen, and they will be answered at the end. And I'll put it over to Leif.
Hello. Here I am hosting an art thing online. Wow. In case you don't know, this is what's going on. We're talking about Lens Reflex. I should give my little blurb. Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to give a little blurb now about Center for Craft C2, a little bit of housekeeping about the auction tonight at 9 p.m. Lot number 2 of MCC's Masks and Makers online fundraising auction will be closed. Show care for your community and support local craft artists by bidding on unique masks and mask-related artworks. Are you frustrated with always coming in second at the local beard growing contest? Bid on the ZZ Mask by Ida Smith and you'll be the envy of your furry hipster friends. Trying to quit smoking during a pandemic? Ooh, check out Tricia Shaw's Don't Quit Now for a humorous and functional take on this dilemma, or celebrate all the things that make Manitoba such a great place to call home with Kathy Ugrin's 24 mask set socially distanced party. Anyone? If you want to get involved with this, go to 32auctions.com/Manitoba Craft to bid now before lot number 2 closes at 9 p.m. The next lot, number 3, opens tomorrow and runs until September the 4th at www.com/Manitoba Craft. Or if you just hate computers, come on down to the C2 Center for Craft at 329 Cumberland Avenue and check out the final auction lot in person. And also, you can see the Lens Reflex show while you're there. Staff can help you place a bid. They are open Wednesday to Saturday, 12 until 4 p.m. Okay, done. That took slightly longer than 10 seconds, but here we go. We are joined. I am joined. We are all together. My name is Leif Norman. Again, just to remind everyone who the heck I am, I run the Flash Photographic Festival, and we've got Sarah Crawley and Nichol Marsch with us. So there we go. They waved in order so you know who is who, and they are both in this show. There is a total of, I think, 6 or 7 different artists in this in the Lens Reflex show. Which, just to give people a quick rundown, hopefully this will take no more than 10 seconds. I thought up a very strange idea about how does craft and photography fit together, or can it even fit together? Because I just thought it was like oil and water. I thought it was just sort of like a comical idea. It's like steak and bananas or something like that. And then we threw it out to the very intelligent and creative Winnipeg artist scene, and they came up with this. And so perhaps I'll just sort of start that off by, because Sarah is on my left side here, I'm going to just arbitrarily ask Sarah Crawley first about what is her take on the idea of how does craft and photography fit together in her world.
Well, thank you, Leif. I would actually like to start with just a couple of thank yous myself, if I could. I want to thank you, Leif, and the other jurors, Peter Tittenberger and Diana Thornycroft. I think the three of you put together a really interesting show. I'm really proud to be part of the show. And when I went to see it, I thought it was such an interesting example of a number of people working independently on their own, practices, kind of either coming together and making new work, or recognizing that the theme that you put out there was in work that they were already working on. But there's so many connections and interesting ideas and connections, not only between the material processes that are used, but the ideas that are present in the work. So I think it's a really beautiful show that the three of you put together. Thank you for that. I also, I want to acknowledge the support of the Manitoba Arts Council and the Winnipeg Arts Council for the production of the work of mine in the show. My thanks also to my partner, John Irvin. He made the shelf, the wooden shelf that my books are sitting on, which for me, that's an integral part of the piece. I also, just a couple more, I want to thank the staff at Martha Street Studio. I work there, and I've learned so much about printmaking and different forms of printmaking and using different kinds of materials. So I don't think I could have achieved the etching on the copper books had I not worked at Martha Street for the last number of years. So they're very, the staff, they're super generous and always very willing to share their knowledge. So I wanted to thank them. And finally, I want to thank all the staff at C2 Center for Craft, and in particular, Katrina, because she's been wonderful through this whole time. The show was supposed to open in April. It got postponed, and I'm so grateful that the center decided to go ahead with the show this summer. It gave me something to look forward to and work towards. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's interesting because I consider myself a photo-based artist, and primarily I work with photographic images, but I also I like to incorporate other mediums or processes into my work. So since working at Martha Street, I've been incorporating different kinds of printmaking into my work, and I think in around the year 2000, so 20 years ago, I started working with bookbinding as well. And to me, those two things go really, really well together, bookbinding and photography. There's so many obvious references when you start thinking of photographs and books being together. So my practice, which has centered on exploring different aspects of identity, and for the past 10 years, really focusing on ideas around memory, place, and loss. I had in those explorations within the past 10 years, I had created a series of photographs shot out the back seat of a moving car. So it was a huge body of work, actually. I mean, you know how it is with photography. Even though I'm working with film, like I know in this day and age with digital, you can take, thousands of images in an hour. With film, it is a little bit slower, but I'm the kind of photographer that makes many images and then kind of sifts through them to figure out what it is that I want to work with within them.
So you're using just a little 35 mil camera? There it is.
This is my camera here. I like having props. Here we go.
Voigtlander, that's fabulous.
Isn't that a lovely camera? And I always bring them when I do even in-person talks. I like to bring the cameras because for me, it's very tactile. The camera itself and working with the camera is a very tactile experience. And so this one happened to be my parents' back when I was a child. So it's a 1950s era Voigtlander camera, fully manual, no light meter, nothing like that. So, but I didn't get my hands on it until 2012, when my dad suddenly realized that I might like this camera that he'd had sitting unused in his basement since around 1970. But they used it in the 60s. They shot with it in the 60s. So it has a funny shutter. It's a bit slow. It kind of responds a bit slowly. And so I started using it in a way, kind of the way my parents had used it. They bought it before we made a big year-long excursion to England. And so they used it in a way, traveling to a place that they knew they wouldn't be staying. And I was really interested in exploring ideas about place and about loss and about a temporary connection to place. And so it seemed really appropriate to use this camera as I embarked on a year of road trips traveling through Manitoba. And so I always made sure I was with a group of people, a collective I was part of at the time called the Pinhole Artist Collective. But I was shooting pinhole at the time I was shooting this, and always sitting in the back seat behind the passenger, because that's the best place to photograph the landscape from. And so that experience just really evoked a lot of thoughts about place, about how place impacts who you are, and the memory of place. So that when the call came out for this show, I thought about those images. They were always meant to be in a book, but I had not yet done the final piece of making the book, actually, binding the book. So I decided to it's always good to give yourself a deadline, right?
Oh, deadlines are the only reason things happen.
That's right.
So photography and book form, do you think they work very well together? Because, well, I don't know. I mean, a book is a very compact way of getting a lot of information across very quickly. It's sort of self-sealing. It protects itself. There's all kinds of things. It's tactile. So what things about having the photos in the book do you really want the audience to play with?
Well, one thing that I really appreciate, and this is kind of an interesting connection to craft. I think the book form perhaps allows you to handle a photograph in a way that you're not usually encouraged to handle a photograph in a gallery. And that's really important to me with these particular books. And every time I've ever shown bookworks, it's really important to me that the viewer handle the book without gloves, that they get that tactile experience of touching the paper, touching the cover. And so they, in a way, they control the experience of even the order of the photographs that they're looking at. So I think there's a different engagement when the viewer is able to pick up a book, choose where they start to look at it. They can choose to look at it the way I made it, so that the order of the images, they're seeing them the way I made them, but then they can go back to it and they can look at it in any way they want. They can, start at the end, start in the middle. And with these particular covers, because they're copper, people's fingerprints will make a mark on that copper. And so the book will continue to shift and to change. And I think that's a nice reference to the way that memories shift and change over time.
Mm-hmm. And actual photographs being handled, they get grubby.
Yeah.
Scrapped and stuff, and they're sort of objects in their own right. Whereas paintings are always want to restore paintings and to bring them back to their perfection, I suppose, right? Peeling off all of the shellac and stuff that's been on it. But a photograph is, like, I love old photographs, old Victorian photographs with all their scratches and stuff, and that becomes part of it. You wouldn't want to repair that. I don't think people would want to repair it. It's like an old scratchy record.
Yeah.
All the pops and hisses and things are somehow endearing. It's like listening to AM radio. It's still with us even in 2020.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because certainly when you're, I think that it makes it an object. It reinforces the fact that the photograph is an object, and it's a separate object than whatever was originally photographed.
Yeah,
so I think when you see those scratches and when you see those marks and you see those sometimes intentional, sometimes not intentional kind of hiccups, it reminds you that that's an object.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like an old wooden bowl or an old chair that's been around forever. Yeah. So Nicole's been very patiently smiling and nodding away, listening to us, or to Sarah.
No, that's great.
And in a way, it occurred to me that all the things that Sarah was talking about, this may be a ridiculous statement, but that maybe this will help conversation, is that Nicole's piece has a lot of opposites to it. It's very ephemeral. You probably don't want people to touch it. It is sort of the beadwork being based on individual digital pixels is digital as opposed to analog with your Voigtlander, Sarah. So use that ridiculous statement as a springboard to talk about your work, Nichol.
For sure. Well, first off, thanks, Sarah, for talking about your project. It's an exciting project to go and actually be able to feel like you're saying, when you feel like the weight of it and the history of it, like the mark making that you guys are talking about. For my project, it's quite different because it does go kind of off of the use of digital photography. And I've used that in a way to form the pattern from all these found images that are not my own, and kind of trying to explore my indigeneity and my experience as a Métis person.
Where did you find the images that are not your own?
They're found images from online.
Okay.
So this project, like I said, is about my indigeneity and learning creation stories through institutional settings, as opposed to traditional knowledge systems, which is what I think a lot of Métis people, or even First Nations or Indigenous people, anybody under that umbrella, kind of find themselves in that position. Yeah, so I've used that to kind of form my pattern. And then I know, I feel like, I guess with Sarah's project being like, you're talking about like bookbinding and photography being really well suited, kind of as a marriage. Like, I guess I find mine as just like directly, I don't know, they're together, but they're separate, because one's a pattern and like one's just informing it as a pattern for the next one, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm.
It makes
I mean,
sense. Like, it's like a domino thing instead of a marriage. It's more of one hits in and then makes another work.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe, I mean, I think the audience, I wish we had a prop. I wish we could actually hold up the art and show people.
I don't have any props. I apologize.
There, we just have to look at that. But Sarah's piece is a really nice, tight little book. It's a fat little book with the metal binding, the covers, and with bright colored images on the inside, like you said, you can flip through. You're supposed to approach it on the table and pick it up and handle it. Nichol, how would you describe your work?
Yeah, so my work is much larger, first of all. So the beadwork is suspended in a large white frame. And for me, that's kind of representational of kind of like the institutionalized learning that I kind of talked about. And that's where the beadwork is falling. And then you're meant to look up at the piece. So it's suspended above the viewer. So
and there's light coming through it, right?
Exactly, yeah. So you have the light coming through, and then the plexiglass, that's kind of the barrier between you and the light, kind of serves as like a reflective surface. So as you are looking up into the piece, you can see yourself in it. So yeah.
I'm so foolish. I didn't notice that.
Yeah.
I would be looking up and being reflected in it.
Yeah.
All the little threads and stuff hanging down was what really caught me. And you mentioned in your artist statement about how the thread, the length of your arm is copied in the length of the thread.
Yeah, exactly. So as I was beading through the work, that's kind of how I determined like the length of thread I was going to work with, was just kind of my arm span. In a lot of my work, I reference the body or my own body. And of course, because this project's about identity and my own identity, it was really important for me to have that. Yeah.
All right, cool. Let's see what other ridiculous things. Oh yes, so analog. Well, photography is sort of doing two things at once right now too. We have our analog history. Film has been around, forever, and everyone thought that, around 2004 or 2005, when digital cameras started to really take off, that film would just be kaput. Although the funny thing is that I think people said the same thing about when cassettes came out, vinyl records would die. And then when color film came out, black and white film should die. And when FM radio came out, AM radio should die. But every single one of these things has just kind of shifted around. It got a little smaller. People are buying more vinyl records than ever before. Polaroid came back from the dead. There's so many bizarre things. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but photography is sort of hyphenated. It's got our digital, purely electronic, very Photoshop-y, sort of the opposite of craft. Would you sort of say that, is it the opposite, or would you say that craft and the digital world can sort of coexist or fight against each other? Or who wants to take that on?
I don't know.
Well, I have a few thoughts about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
One thing that, so yeah, it's interesting. I have heard, digital photography, I guess, can feel very hands off. I happen to still be very rooted in the darkroom, so that is where I come from. and using other kind of experimental methods like pinholes, so you build your own cameras. Because I know when I started doing more less darkroom work, so still shooting film, but scanning it and then printing digitally, I really missed that hands-on experience of just handling something, of making something with your hands. And that kind of led me in a way to pinhole photography, because I could make the cameras. So I'm very much rooted in that way, things like lumen printing and cyanotype. So photography still feels super organic and hands-on to me, but I think there are really, really interesting ways that people are using digital photography and maybe starting in the computer, but then taking it out of the computer. Like Nicole's piece, where she is working with digital images, straight up digital source images, but then creating a tactile pattern that she's beading from. And I think some of the other artists in the show, like for instance, certainly Grace Nichol and Michael Zajac, their collaborative piece together, where they're working with everything from clay, which is one of the oldest forms of making anything that we have on our planet, and these really experimental photography. I mean, I had to look up what peripheral photography was, because that's one of the processes that Michael and Grace used together. So now I know what it is.
Could you explain in a sentence what peripheral photography is? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Well,
didn't understand it either.
Is to create a 360-degree photograph, a photograph that depicts an object photographed from every side of the object. So the camera has to move around the object. And it got into some pretty technical, descriptions when I looked it up online, which I kind of glassed over when I read the technical stuff. But I think the way that Michael and Grace have used it is really interesting, and ultimately creating 3D works that are 3D printed, but also works that are made from clay. And the way that they've kind of bridged those things, I think, is fascinating. They couldn't do that without the digital photography part. One other last thing, and then I'll let Nicole have a say. But the other thing that I find is kind of interesting about digital photography is that it has made it more accessible to more people, right? Like, you used to, really the only people who ever carried cameras around before were photographers, or people who, had an intense interest and would end up in the darkroom for hours on end. But I think now it's made it a more accessible medium for many, many more people. And I think that there's a connection with craft with that. Not that some craft materials aren't expensive, they are, but I think craft is a more accessible, it's very broad, obviously, but I think craft can be more accessible for more people.
Yeah.
That's cool. I never thought of that about like fine art is wonderful and great, but it is not necessarily known as being accessible. Like you can go to the Louvre and look at all the great stuff, but one doesn't necessarily think, oh, I could do that, or I could own that, or, it's overwhelming. Whereas craft is much more open and, I guess, egalitarian in a way. And now that everybody has a phone and a video camera and a still camera in their pocket at all times, that's very egalitarian, and anyone and everyone can take pictures. So that's very interesting too.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, take pictures and just being able to experience craft, right? Like the way that a lot of the galleries have had to go with all the stuff going on and shows being postponed, just being able to use the digital as just a means of seeing a show. But yeah, I like the idea that you're talking about, Sarah. You sparked my mind for my project, talking about like the digital photography being more hands-off. And I think for me, that was part of why I used it in this project, and parts of why I've used it in other projects. Because for me, I'm not photo based, but I use photography in different ways in my project. And I usually use the analog for the purpose of being hands-on and being more intimate and more connected to the project. And I think for this one, digital just suited it better, because I was working with like I said, found images and different ways of learning things, and in a way that was more hands-off and was more inaccessible. So I was using that approach.
So Nicole, in your previous works, you have done beading based off of analog photos or something like that?
Not beading, no, just different projects based off of analog. Things that I've like used the film to like cut up and use in that way, like literally physical. Analog was kind of the way I started using like superimposition in my work. Because as Sarah was talking about her camera kind of having quirks, one of the cameras I've used kind of slips when I try to roll like to the next part of the film.
Oh, so you
had
get
a lot of like
overlapping images?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of accidental, and sometimes it's really fun because if I've stopped from one project and I don't realize and I'm going to another one, and I don't realize that my film's slipping, it could be two totally different things that are happening. And that sparked my interest in using photography in that way, and kind of layering images and kind of distilling things down. I don't know if it's the right word, but I always say like if I'm doing that, if I'm taking a mass of images and I'm kind of putting them into one, I'm trying to find like the aura of whatever I've documented or the experience that I've had or stuff like that. So
it's funny that both of you have talked about cameras and they're both slightly broken.
Yeah.
Just a little,
yeah.
But you're taking advantage of it so that in the way that if they work perfectly, in a way you wouldn't be happy. You like the wonkiness of the cameras, so that's pretty fun. That's actually very crafty, I suppose, too.
So yeah. I think another that it makes me think too that just Nichol, where you're talking about the where the camera would slip and you would kind of forget, and so you get images from one body of work perhaps crossing over another, and that you embrace that. I think there's a at least in my approach to photography, I love that kind of accidental thing that can happen, and kind of opening yourself up to those. I always think of it as like letting the materials and the equipment have some say in what you end up making. And I think that might be similar to how a lot of craft artists work, because they're so intimately connected to the materials that they're working with. The materials are always, to me, in the materials were so important in craft work, and they are so tactile. So I think there's that another kind of an interesting connection in the way that some photographers and some craft artists approach the actual materials that they're using, and allowing those materials to have a lot of say in the final piece.
Exactly.
I think one other one is like this slow art. I think again,
speed.
Yeah, speed. So digital photography, obviously very fast, but there are so many interesting ways to slow it down, such as Nichol working with layering different digital images and ultimately creating, like I loved your description just now of like finding the aura of what it is that you're photographing. I think that's really, really beautiful. And I think that's, that when I think of some of the other work that's in the show, like Lesley Nakonechny's book,
the solar graphs,
lumen prints.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, the lumen prints. And in her description, they took 2.5 to 3 hours to expose. That's just the exposure time. And in Willow's piece, Willow Rector's piece, where she references the wet collodion process, also even though the photographs that she has in the show are digital, but they're digital images of a wet collodion print.
And how the development, the image starts ghostly and comes out like a specter. It's really quite creepy and neat.
And neat. And to me, that the time that those kinds of processes take are reflected also in the time that a lot of craft work takes. Like I think of Nichol beading. That beading must have taken a very, very long time.
Yes, a lot of cross-eyed hours, I like to say.
A lot of which?
Cross-eyed hours.
Cross-eyed. Well, beading is, and you're using very small beads too.
Yeah.
Those little seed beads.
Yeah, it's definitely a very intimate process. And even just like I said, because it's identity, I found that I had to kind of sometimes like just step away from it for a little while and then go back to it and kind of go in and out of it, just physically and emotionally. So yeah, craft definitely has that. You have to have, I think, not to say that digital photography doesn't have as much heart. But I think when you're doing craft-based things and committing so much time, there's a little bit more of the body going into it. So
no, I
Yeah.
think I would allow you to say that digital is a little bit soulless, a little cold, because you know, Instagram being what it is, or Facebook, the way people are sharing images now, it's just this. You know, it's like, so next, show me something else, next. You never touch it. You may never have actually been to that particular part of the Banff, you know, national park, you know. It doesn't, and it doesn't matter, because it just looks so good, or someone's, you know, meal that they're about to eat. It's detached, whereas craft and analog film is very touchy-feely. You literally get chemicals on you. You literally have to, you know, push things around and touch them and drip them.
You get what are they called on your fingers there, Nicole, when you're beating?
A callus?
Calluses.
Yeah.
Or you get silver nitrate stains that don't rub off for weeks.
Don't want those.
But so yeah, digital is, you know, it's wonderful that everyone does have a camera in their pocket, but I mean, I just took 1,000 pictures just in August alone.
Yeah.
Then, you know, what do I do with them? I mean, I keep them for some record. I mean, they never get printed out. They never really get seen much. I share maybe 1% of them ever. And then the act of sharing, it takes what, 4 seconds? I mean, people don't gaze upon it and slow themselves down like going to a gallery does, where you have to stop and look up, you know, or stop and pick up a book, or stop and consider, I mean, what is going on with this, you know, 3D printed object, and, you know, and what was it called? Peripheral photography.
It's interesting because you know, something that I often think about with, like, what young people today, very young people who have only ever known really digital photography, and don't tend to see their photographs printed out. And I think how will that influence them in the future? In a couple different ways, like in terms of memory, because our photographs are such a great memory trigger, and they're so linked to ideas around memory, because they do hold that instant in time. But also, like, certainly I know, I recognize that one of the reasons that I really like making photo books and hand-bound photo books, and one of the reasons that I'm really interested in script, and I'm quite interested in, like, barely legible script. So in my book, the 2 books at C2, there's barely legible script etched into the copper, and then the same barely legible script is hand embossed into the photographs. And that comes directly from the experience of a child of looking at photo albums. You know, my mom, it annoyed me at the time, but I'm grateful now that she did it. She wrote on the back of photographs all the time. You know, she wrote who it was and the year. And the reason it annoyed me as a child is because it would indent the front of the photograph sometimes. You'd write with a ballpoint, and it would then
You're a purist.
Indent.
But I don't want to see that.
Exactly, right? Now I love that indent. I love that notion of, you know, that her hand touched that paper and made that mark. And that mark has now become a part of that photograph.
Yeah.
So I think about ideas of memory, and I think about photography so very much linked with ideas of memory. And it started me thinking about how is craft also linked to memory. And for me, I think one of the big ways that craft kind of contains memory is the physical memory of the person making it. So again, like Nicole said, you know, very much like it's very physical, and your body is a part of it. But that, you know, so bookbinding for me, it's all that repetition, right? You know, you're doing that same thing over and over and over again. And so you're getting the muscle memory of that repetitious movement. And it reminded me of a quote that I heard, I think Seema Goyal was the first person that I heard say this, but it's attributed to the Asero tribe of Indonesia. And it says, knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the muscle. Which I think is isn't that a lovely, like, knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the muscle. And in the context of craft, it's that, you know, doing something again like the beating again and again, the motion of the beating, or the motion
or making bread,
bookbinding, making bread,
making a boat.
Yep, whatever it is that you're making. And so for me, knowledge is linked to memory, and so I think that memory is very much a part of craft work as well.
Yeah, maybe memory is actually much less with the eyes and more with the hands, because or with smells. You know how a smell can bring you back, and you can be 3 years old, and sounds. And so with these digital natives, as these young kids are called, they may never have their pictures printed out. And so what, I mean, 20 years in the future, are they going to go to an antique store and then hold up an iPad full of someone else's photos?
Maybe.
Exactly.
I collect old Victorian photos because of course I do, and I go to numerous bookstores all around Canada and finding stuff, and on the backs people will have written who this is. So one will say George Jenkins graduated in 1912, and I was going through, and then I found a picture of a woman standing in front of a house, and I turned it over, and all it said on the back was me. So it was very helpful for us in the future to know who that was. So it was a funny joke. It was that, oh, that's you. Of course it's you. It's me. So end of silly joke. Well, we have a couple more minutes, I suppose, and then maybe Katrina will come back, and I don't even know if the YouTube people have typed in any questions. It's a mystery until she pops up. But there was something I was going to say about muscle memory and beading, and to tie back into Nicole's work about the physicality of it, and how that does sort of it sort of makes a fool a little bit of the digital world, because I think it's actually quite kind of cute. I don't know if that's the best word, but cute in that a single bead is a pixel, because it does sort of make a joke of the computer world, that you've taken a little glass thing and said, look, here it is, here's this thing that you can't touch, and it's really tiny, and I'm going to stitch this little guy onto this thing, and then you have to look at it.
Exactly. Yeah, it definitely makes it more real for sure. I'm just trying to think of what you and Sarah were talking about with the muscle memory and stuff like that. And I just, every time I kind of hear that kind of thing, I just picture craft, because it's so based in like knowledge that's been translated through generations. And I mean, you're living that motion, that moment, that, like you're both saying, like the sound and the feeling and experience that like everybody before you felt, right? And the people who perfected that craft and stuff like that. So I get really like nerdy or whatever when I think of stuff like that, and the lineage of it. So
I love that. I mean, that's so lovely that it goes beyond the singular, and it goes beyond the individual. And that I mean, it kind of references back to that accessibility of craft, because I was also thinking of it in terms of the sharing, you know, like that people share patterns and they teach each other
very much
and how that is, that it's a long lineage of passing on that information from one generation to another. It's really lovely way to think of the memory of craft being passed in that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Books are great and everything for transmitting knowledge, and I don't know who said it, but akin to your quote, Sarah, that you came up with before, is someone said that knowledge not shared is lost. And even putting it in a book doesn't necessarily mean that it's shared. It can just sit on a shelf and no one can ever look at it. And the actual physicality of apprenticeship, which is, I wish apprenticeship should come back, you know, apprentice bakers and carpenters and everything, because some things you can't learn from a book. So many things you cannot learn from a book. I mean, being a plumber or a bricklayer, I mean, imagine trying to learn bricklaying from a book, or swimming. It's ridiculous, right? It becomes very silly. In the same way that trying to experience the Icefields Parkway through Instagram is ridiculous.
Exactly.
It's very pretty. Those photos are very, very pretty of Moraine Lake or whatever the heck, the most popular Instagram place in Canada is. But you go there, it doesn't look like that. The photographer is so good that they made reality look better than it is, which is then that it comes onto a whole new line of discussion. But I started collecting recently old carpentry, old hand tools, planes and chisels and stuff. And it's astounding just working with wood and, cutting your fingers on sharp blades and stuff. You really need to do it. Like a books are great, knowledge is great, but somebody grabbing you by the scruff of your neck and saying, come on out here, we're gonna fix up this old shed or something. That's how civilization moves forward. I would hope to think, without getting overly poetic, but you know what I mean. So craft, I'm feeling very warm and fuzzy about craft right now.
Exactly. Rightfully so.
Yeah. As opposed to all of those giant 10-foot tall paintings in the Louvre, which are of battles or whatever,
Exactly.
like whatever the heck that stuff is.
Yeah.
So anyway, gosh, I don't even know what else to talk about. We've talked about speed. We've talked about tactility. I think the experiment was a success. I honestly thought that it was going to be a bit of a joke. And I'm very happy to see that these two disparate ideas can fit together. Although maybe people are just so darn clever, you could give them any two random things and say, make an art show out of it, and they would.
Well, one thing I think is interesting. I think there's at least two artists in the show. I think that both Willow and Janine-Annette mentioned in their artist statements that they have kind of a dual practice, that they both do photography in and of itself.
Yes.
And they do craft work in and of itself, and that they merge them. And I think it was Janine-Annette who said she was starting to merge them anyways, and when this call came out, and so it felt like a good time
fabulous.
for her. But and also Willow merging those two practices within her work. And I think it is interesting that I think a lot of artists of every kind use photography in part of their process, simply because of the nature of what it is. But I love the fact that it comes out either what am I trying to say, that it also becomes part of the final thing that's on the wall or in the gallery, for some people it always remains just a step in the process that nobody sees, whereas other people have more fluidity with photography and whichever other medium they're using, whether it's paint or different craft mediums, that the photo ends up as a part of the actual piece. I think that's interesting. And then there's some of us, like myself, who more firmly identify as lens-based, and some probably in the like say Tricia Wasney, who probably more firmly identifies as a craft and jewelry artist.
There we go.
So I think that you did a really interesting job. The jurors did an interesting job of really being open to those of us who this is something new for thinking wise, and to people who've already been thinking about putting the two together and working in different ways. So yeah, and because there's so many themes too that feel like they reoccur. I think the connection to land or place or landscape feels to me like that is a recurring theme in the show, as well as memory and time. And whenever I think of memory and time, that always triggers for me thoughts of loss too. So I see that a little bit in some of the work as well, this sense of loss in the work. So I think again that it was just it may have been a wild idea, Leif. You may have thought this is like so out there, nobody's going to do it, but I think you hit on an interesting notion, and I think it's reflected in the work in the show.
Well, I'm glad it all worked out.
Yeah.
Katrina's here.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Katrina.
One thing, or I just wanted to make a comment to something that I had thought of while you were talking, which was you were talking about this like the return of the analog, like the record, Polaroid, all of these things. But I think as we get more digital, people crave analog more and more. Like, we've adapted for millennia to work with our hands, and then suddenly the majority of us like spend the majority of our time not working with our hands at all, in fact, in front of screens. So I think that this, like, I think that you're onto something with that, because I think like why aren't these sort of analog processes dying out? And I think at the end of the day, it's that it just feels really good to do them. Like, it feels really good. It feels natural. Not that using digital stuff is unnatural, but I think at the end of the day, as craftspeople, I think we have a really strong urge to work with our hands. And I think that a lot of craft-based artists do work with analog film, like the two of you, for that reason. And that I've heard a lot of people talk about how, like Sarah was saying, that they didn't necessarily love the switch to digital because there was that loss of working with your hands. So I think that craft and photography, analog photography, are actually quite linked. But the part that struck me as interesting was that you were working with digital images, Nichol, which is a bit less craft-based, but like you converted that into such a craft-based practice that I thought that was really cool. If anyone has any questions for artists, they can enter them into the live stream chat. If you're on like a desktop, it's on the right side. If you're on mobile, you can scroll down. We do have a question from Susie Smith for Sarah, who would love to hear about your use of text in the piece. It feels both intimate and hidden at the same time.
Yes. Well, thank you, Susie, for that question. Yeah, I like to refer to it as barely legible. And I love that relationship between photography and the written word. And I think that, you know, stemming not only from my mom writing on the back of photos, but also captions in photo albums, so that, you know, and handwritten captions in photo albums. I just think there's such an interesting, both a visual connection and also an interesting cultural connection between the written word and photography. However, not being a writer, I'm also a little bit afraid of the written word. Like, I think it's, I know it can be very poetic. I know that writers who really know how to write can write a paragraph or a phrase that is very open-ended and can have multitudes of meanings. But I'm not very good at that. So I always feel like, I think my images can have multitudes of meanings, and I like having work that's quite open, that allows people to come into it and bring their own, you know, history, their own experience to it. And so they bring their own meaning to the piece. And I'm always a little bit afraid with text or script that it shuts that down. That if I put a word under a photograph, it says too firmly, it makes too firm a connection, and it doesn't allow for the viewer to bring their own connections. So, but I really love the visual of text and imagery and photographic imagery together. So I work with that by making my script barely legible. So, but I'm glad that Susie found that it felt intimate as well as hidden. I wanted there to be kind of a subtleness to especially the hand embossed work that you might not even realize is there at first until you notice there's little white flecks because some of the pigment has come off where that embossing is. So I think sometimes you might not even realize that script is there until maybe you feel it on one of the pages, and then that might kind of trigger you to look back. And in terms of the actual phrases that are in there, they were phrases that were or sentences that were said during the road trips that we were on. So while we would, you know, be driving around and I'd be shooting out the window, if somebody said a phrase that would just capture my imagination, I would write it down. And so I have many of these kind of random phrases that have significance to me, but I don't really know what, you know, if you could actually read what it said, and maybe you can read what it says, but, you know, you can interpret it yourself then too. So.
Cool.
We don't have any more questions at this time, but we'll leave it open for a few more minutes in case anybody else has any for anybody else. I guess my question for the two of you is, like, Nichol, I have a like kind of technical question because I'm also a textile person. So how did you convert your images into beading? Did you zoom really far into your image and get all of your pixels, or did you sort of translate it like on grid paper with the colors? I'm really curious. So,
So a lot of it was just done digitally. So for this one, it was like sized to kind of the size I wanted. So I wanted kind of something similar to what I have up there. And then I just made it so that it was kind of 10 pixels by 10 pixels in an inch. And then just for like my own sanity, I like reduced the colors down a little bit. So instead of working with like 200 colors and some that were super similar, I think I worked with about 30 different colors, and just worked off the pattern that way. So yeah, I had a lot of like zoomed in sections of the image and kind of worked like row by row.
That's so interesting that you were going from this incredibly digital process to moving into like, you can't get much more analog than beading, you know? It's been interesting to see how some artists approached it, starting out really digitally and then moving into more analog. So like Grace and Michael were an example of that. And then some people started out really analog and then moved into digital, like Willow, who had the analog, I can't remember the type of print because I'm not a photographer, I'm sorry. And then converted them to digital prints. But it's interesting to see the contrast when people do that. So thank you.
I definitely, I was one of those photographers, like when Leif was talking about back in the early 2000s when digital was taking over everything. And I was definitely one of those photographers that was living in fear that film would disappear. But I think it's an amazing, I came around and realized that there's room for everyone. There's room for all kinds of photographic processes. And I think it is an amazing time to be an artist and to be interested in photography, because all those old processes are still doable. And so is digital. And there's so many interesting ways that people are merging the two, marrying the two. And like we spoke of earlier, just bringing that process to other mediums and to other forms of art making, and the back and forth, like the kind of layering of different processes that you see certainly in works like Michael's and Grace's. Oh my gosh, like the kind of the back and forth, the play between the very, very hands-on clay work to the 3D photography and back again. And I'm still don't completely understand what they did, but they made an amazing body of works that have a really interesting relationship to one another on the wall when you view them.
Exactly.
I would also say that there's something really interesting happening with digital technology right now, whereas for a couple of decades, it's sort of been like, well, you're doing a version of a thing that you did analog, but kind of the digital version of that. So like you can draw on a tablet, but drawing on a tablet is nothing like drawing on paper. You know, it's like you're using layers and transparencies. It's a completely different practice, which is very valuable and appreciated, but not the same, you know? And I think we're in this really interesting place with technology now where we can actually work a bit more or pretty dang close in some cases to how you would work analog, but it's translated into a digital medium. So we're getting into an interesting place where we can kind of play with the two a bit more fluidly because the technology's kind of caught up a little bit in a lot of ways, whereas for a long time, it was apples and oranges, you know? So it's a very interesting time.
Yeah, when Instagram first came out, I don't even know how many years ago it was now, they had all these built-in filters, which I thought was ridiculous because all they did was make your digital picture look like a 1974 Kodak print that was faded, or this one made it look like a cyanotype, or this one made it look like a pinhole, or this one, and all it was doing, it wasn't doing anything of its own style. It was just totally ripping off previous things. And so hopefully in the future, digital will try to come of its own, you know, try to fill its own boots instead of just copying old stuff. But I mean, we've had the entire 20th century to get used to these particular ways, you know, like when you Xerox a photograph, it sort of looks, it makes it really crunchy and destroys all of the subtlety of it. But you know, looks great on the cover of a punk record, you know. So I'm looking forward to Photoshop doing something which is interesting and something I haven't seen before. I mean, there's sort of fantastical things going on now where people are doing hybrid stuff, like, you know, take a picture of a girl but then turn her into a mermaid and then make her go underwater and then have the furniture floating around. I mean, that's made up totally digitally, and that might be an actual real digital thing that we could call truly digital. But then it's just always turns into like dragons and fantastical beasts and stuff. So it's not even that. It's like just the same stuff again. There's nothing new under the sun. I'm still waiting for digital photography to you know, show me something new that I haven't seen before, and it's just doing the same old stuff, like black and white or sepia tones or something like that. So anyway, that's my tirade, even though I make all my money as a digital photographer. Although not much anymore. I mean.
Well, folks, it's been awesome hearing from all three of you. And if anyone would like to check out Sarah Crawley or Nichol Marsch's work, or the other artists in Lens Reflex, please check it out. It's open until Saturday, August 29th. And it's a really, really quite beautiful show. The other artists are Sarah. So we have Sarah Crawley, Nichol Marsch, Sandra Vincent, Lesley. Sarah, you pronounced her last name so beautifully. Can you say it again?
I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. Nakonechny.
Thank you. I'm not from Central Canada, and there's some last names that I still struggle with every now and again. We have Janine-Annette Littmann, we have Tricia Wasney, and then we have Grace and Michael, who we mentioned a few times, and then also Willow Rector. So we'd love to have you come down to the center and see it.